Welcome to Moments with Mary Ann. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest, Phil Keith. And he's here today to share with us his new book, All Blood Runs Red, The Legendary Life of Eugene Bullard, Boxer, Pilot, Soldier, Spy. Now, Phil is the author of 6 books, including Blackhorse Riders, which won the 2012 award from the USA Book News for Best Military Nonfiction, and was a finalist for the 2013 Colby Awards. In 2013, he also earned the Civil Medal for Military Writers Society of America. He holds a degree in history from Harvard and is a former Navy aviator. During 3 tours in Vietnam, he served with distinction and was awarded the Purple Heart, Air Medal, Presidential Unit Citation, and the Navy Commendation Medal. So let's welcome to the show, Phil Keith.
Well, thank you, Mary Ann. It's delightful to be here.
You know, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. I was so excited to not only read this book, but just to hear the story that you guys went through, you and your co-author went through, to really find out about this information.
Yeah, it was quite a discovery, and we were very, very lucky to sort of unearth this material. It had been kind of lying around in plain sight in a couple of instances, and we were shocked that no one had really done much with it, because this guy clearly was one of the most fascinating figures of the 20th century, and his story really deserves to be told.
Well, there's so much about Eugene's life, and I can't wait to dive into this. And I'd love for you to share with us, how you initially learned about his thread in history.
Well, I was researching another book on World War I for the 100th anniversary of America's participation in what was then called, of course, the Great War. And one of the chapters in that book was going to be about Americans who flew for the American Air Service in World War I. You know, some of the famous names we've all heard before, like Eddie Rickenbacker and so forth. And when the Americans finally did come into that war in 1917, one of the first things that the Air Service did was issue a call for Americans who had been flying for other countries, and many young Americans had been flying for France before America got into the war. So, and that included Eugene, having, of course, been originally born in Georgia, and then trained by the French to be a fighter pilot. And so they all ran off to Paris to sign up and get into American aviation. And then down in this footnote at the bottom of some material that I was researching was this: well, they were all accepted but one. And his name was Eugene Bullard, the first African-American fighter pilot in history. And I said to myself, what? Who is this? I've never heard of this guy. And that was my first clue about Gene. So I immediately dialed up some other information that I had been pulling together, and I began to get little snippets and pieces of his story. And when I began to pull them all together into, one long thread, I said to myself, my goodness, what a story. I mean, this is a book in and of itself. And that's how it got started.
Oh, my goodness. Well, and what a fascinating person in history he is. I mean, he has a very unique background when we look at how he was raised.
Yeah, he does. I mean, when you think about Black Americans in the South around the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th. And of course, unfortunately, many of the Jim Crow laws and rules were still in effect, and blacks were living in kind of society that I think any one of us would find unpleasant. And Gene was born into a family that was on the wrong side of poverty, and his dad was basically a day laborer down along the docks, acting as sort of a longshoreman. His mother was, interestingly, a full-blooded Creek Indian, and there were 10 children in the family ultimately, 7 of whom lived to adulthood. Gene was one. But, just imagine a young kid in that kind of poverty and racist environment in the Deep South in early, 1900, 1905, 1910, when he was growing up and becoming a young man, and not having too many advantages. But the one thing we really admire about Gene in his story is that he was always so persistent and so determined that whenever life presented him with an opportunity, he tried to grab it. And when life presented him with an obstacle, he tried to overcome it. And we were just utterly fascinated by his determination and all the twists and turns that his life took. I mean, there's enough life stories to fill 10 lifetimes here.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, I'm curious where that, perseverance comes from. Perhaps maybe his father or mother or both. But I mean, when you read the story about an 11-year-old setting out on his own, I mean, I think of myself at 11, and that would be a really hard thing to consider.
Yeah, it would. I mean, basically, he decided to run away from home. He had $1.50 in his pocket, and he was headed to a place that he had only heard about from his father, a place called France. And his dad had told him that France was another country far across the sea that was much less racist and much more tolerant of the different races. And Gene had basically, in his own young life, had enough of oppression and threats. And he said, I'm going to go there. I'm going to get there. And he had no idea where it was or how he was going to go about it. But he literally put his head down and started walking down the railroad tracks and endured some 2-3 years of adventure in the Deep South, but ultimately found his way by hitching rides and asking people and hiding aboard trains. He eventually found himself in Newport News, Virginia, and he stowed away on a freighter. He had heard the crew of this particular ship talking, and it was a language he didn't understand. He said, well, that must be French. Well, it turned out it was German, but the crew was headed to Scotland, and he managed to hitch a ride on this tramp steamer. The crew, of course, found him out pretty quickly as a stowaway, but they took pity on him and put him to work in the kitchen, and he sort of worked his way across the Atlantic, ended up in Glasgow, Scotland, and from there, another series of adventures working his way down through Scotland and England, Liverpool in particular, and then London. Finally getting to France only after he had decided he wanted to train as a boxer, of all things. And he turned out to be pretty good at it. He had a natural talent for it. And he fell under the supervision of a couple of famous boxers of the day, and they allowed him to get on the fight card with them, and they had some bouts in France and Paris. So Gene finally got there, and once he got there, he said, yep, this is the place for me. And a whole another phase of his life began.
Oh, just so interesting. I mean, of all things, going on this, you don't know where you're going. You just kind of hitch a ride on a ship, and the winds take you where they take you. And what just an interesting journey he had. At what point did he become involved in the military?
Well, by the time he had gotten to France and begun to be a fairly successful prize fighter, he was just over 18 years old, if you can imagine. And he found himself in Paris and trying to settle down right during the summer of 1914. And of course, that was the time period in the year when First World War broke out. And he said to himself, they're treating me so well here in France. I really feel as if I must, do something to help my adopted country. And he went right down to the military recruitment office nearby where he was living. And they basically told him, well, sorry, but you're too young. You can't enlist until you turn 19. Well, that October, and of course the war had started in August, that October he went right back to the recruiting office and said, okay, now I'm 19. I'm ready to sign up. And they said, well, that's all good, but, you're not native French, you're an American, and the only service you can join is the French Foreign Legion. He said, that's okay, I'll sign up. And he did. And unbelievably, just 3 or 4 short months later, after some pretty minimal training, he and his newfound friends in the Legion were in the trenches. And the trenches were, as I'm sure you know, a terrible place to be. And he saw some of the worst fighting, some of the most ferocious battles. He was in a company of men in the Legion that on one particular day, 250 men in his company, they went charging across through no man's land, trying to attack the Germans on the other side of this piece of territory. They were unsuccessful, and when they came back, there were 29 of them left out of 250.
Oh, my God.
Just ferocious fighting. He was wounded a couple of times. Then during the Battle of Verdun in the early part of 1916, he was wounded very seriously, almost killed outright. But he was picked up and evacuated and pulled back from the front, and in fact sent down to the city of Lyon in a private hospital, and was allowed to recover. It took him about 6 months. And then after he had finished his recovery, he said to the doctors, well, I'm ready to go back. And they said, not so fast, my friend, you're done. You really don't have the mobility anymore. You have been seriously wounded. We appreciate your service to France, but, that's it. He said, but the war's still going on. I have to do something. And they said to him, well, maybe the only thing you could do is join the aviation service. And he initially did that, starting out as a machine gunner, which is what he had been in the trenches, but now he was going to take his machine gun and leap into the air with a pilot in the front and he in the back. But being the enterprising guy that he was, he quickly figured out that it's better to be a pilot than being the fellow in the back with everybody shooting at you. So he actually talked his way into becoming a trainee as a pilot. And very long story short, he was pretty good at it. And about 8 months after he started, he was designated as a fighter pilot. And he was indeed the first African-American fighter pilot in history. And he continued to fly for the French. He was involved in a couple of pretty big aerial battles. We believe he shot down at least 2 German or enemy aircraft. He had some very narrow escapes of his own. But he finished the war with great credibility and highly decorated, hero of France. And when he was mustered out in early 1919, he went back to Paris, but with his wounds and so forth, he was not able to get back into the ring as a boxer. Although he eventually would recover, about 90% of his original strength and capability, he decided he had to do something different. So he said, not many jobs for ex-fighter pilots in Paris. So maybe I'll become a musician. And he started to bang away on some drums, and he was terrible. But in those days, as long as you were, making a lot of noise and the champagne was pouring freely, it really didn't matter too much how bad you might be. But he became very good, and that was the beginning of his life in the jazz age in Paris in the 20s and 30s.
Just amazing the life he lived. He went from one thing, and many times it seems like he was at the right place at the right time, or just had the right way of being able to communicate with people to move himself, forward, like, from the gunner to becoming the pilot. And it's just a very interesting, intriguing story.
He was always pushing ahead. He was always trying to better himself. He was always trying to learn more and do more. For a kid with basically a second grade education and not a very robust one at that, from the schools that he was allowed to participate in back home in Columbus, Georgia, he had apparently a very bright mind. He ended up learning to speak French fluently, of course, because he lived there for so many years. He also picked up and spoke German. He spoke Italian, and always very good with numbers, quick with figures. And he really parlayed that natural intelligence into a very prolific career. At one point, he owned not only his own jazz nightclub, but down the street a gymnasium, and he was making quite a bit of money and doing very well for himself until late 1930s. As you certainly know, the clouds of war started gathering again, and France was under threat once more.
Well, it's interesting what he does then. And I would love for you to share with our listeners how he got into the spy business.
Yeah, that is a very interesting part of his story. Well, his club was one of the most popular clubs in Paris. And it turned out that a number of the Germans who were infiltrating Paris, of course, their spy services and their military services were sending people in advance to kind of check things out and spy on the French and so on and so forth. And they were gathering literally by the thousands in Paris. And a number of them really favored Jean's club as a gathering place. And one day, an inspector of the French police in Paris showed up on Jean's doorstep at his club and said, "Could I talk with you?" And they chatted for a while, and the inspector said, we've been sort of watching your club, and we noticed that a number of very important Germans are coming here, and knowing that you are a hero of France and you fought for us in World War I and so on, would you perhaps might be willing to, just listen up, and if you hear anything you think we might be interested in, just pass it on to us. And Jean, who was very profoundly French at this point in his life and really hated the Nazis as he was beginning to see them infiltrate his country, his adopted country, he immediately said, "Yes, I'll be very happy to help you out, but you have to promise me one thing." And the inspector said, "Well, what is that?" And he said, "If I get in trouble and something happens to me, which could very well happen in this business, you have to take care of my children." And at that point, he actually had 2 young daughters. And the inspector said, "Don't worry, monsieur, if something happens, we will certainly take care of your children." So that began Eugene's career of spying on the Germans who were coming to his club. And he, although he spoke excellent German, he really pretended he didn't speak German at all. So the Germans who came to the club felt very safe in talking about whatever they wanted to talk about in front of Gene. And as long as he kept pouring the champagne, they kept talking. And Gene also had a partner in this business, which the French underground had given him, a very lovely young lady whose name was truly Cleopatra, only she went by Kitty, and she kind of flirted with the Germans, and Gene poured their champagne, and they picked up lots of good information. In fact, we believe that they were the first to really understand that the Germans were getting ready to and about to invade Poland in September of 1939, of course. And Gene and Kitty passed that information right up the line to their superiors, but for some reason, and we don't know why, it was ignored. And lo and behold, the Germans started the war by invading Poland.
Well, I'm sure they paid attention to whatever information they gave them thereafter, realizing that it was credible. And
yes.
You look at this and it's like, gosh, had he not been that 11-year-old boy who ran away and just got on a ship, with a bunch of Germans, how fluent would he actually be in German,
Right. Well, that's why another reason we think he, was a pretty intelligent guy, because he was able to pick up these languages so quickly and did very well with them. But unfortunately, of course, the war eventually came to France, and Gene was, by that time, the Germans were getting a little suspicious of him, and so he decided to shut down his club and shut down his gym. And try to move on. And what he decided to do, even though at that point he was 44 years old, he decided he would go try to find his old military unit from World War I and join up again and try to help them in the fight. Sadly, he did uncover where they were, but they had already been overrun and practically wiped out. But Gene was able to find another unit that was still fighting down in the city of Orléans. And it turned out that one of the officers that he had been commanded by in World War I was now the senior officer in this unit. So he readily accepted Gene, even with his advanced age. He said, "Yeah, come on, I'll give you a machine gun and a crew. Let's go fight." Which Gene did, and sadly, he was wounded yet again. And this time, it was really time for him to quit the fight. And the resistance managed to smuggle him out of southern France through Spain and into Portugal. And the Red Cross gave him shelter and put him on a ship back to New York. And for the first time in almost 30 years, he sailed into New York Harbor in early 1940, and he was back in his native country. He had about $25 in his pocket, and unfortunately had lost most, in fact, all of the money he had made so successfully in his club business in France. So once again, he had to start life anew.
That doesn't really seem to deter this gentleman. I mean, he was going to do what he needed to do to be successful.
Yes, he took on a couple of odd jobs. He was at one point a longshoreman, which was not very good for his aching back and his war injuries. So then he became a perfume salesman. And at this time, he was, of course, still incredibly worried about his daughters who were still stuck in France. But true to their word, the resistance managed to smuggle them out through, again, Spain and Portugal, and got them on a ship and back to New York and reunited with their father. And Gene settled in a small apartment, partially paid for by the French government in Spanish Harlem, and that's where he lived really the rest of his days. And while the Second World War was raging on, he tried to help with French causes in New York. And then after the war was successfully concluded, he went back to work for one of his old friends, Louis Armstrong, a fellow that he had spent quite a bit of time with in his club in Paris. And after he worked for Armstrong for a couple of years, basically as an advanced man and translator, he decided to take up another opportunity that his friends had secured for him, and he became, of all things, an elevator operator in Rockefeller Center in New York City. Pretty easy work because, his body had been through a lot over the course of his lifetime, but it put him in at least contact with a lot of famous people in the radio and TV business in particular who were going in and out of Rockefeller Center. And one day, he was in his elevator operator's uniform and working his job when Dave Garroway, who was the original host of the Today Show, got on the elevator. And of course, he'd seen Gene before, but that particular day, Gene was wearing, as sometimes he did, one of his military decorations on his elevator operator's uniform. And Dave Garroway looked at it and said, Gene, what is that you've got there? And Gene said, well, Mr. Garroway, that's the Legion of Honor, which is France's highest decoration. And Garroway said, how in heaven's name did you get that? And he began to tell him the story, and Garroway said, look, we've got to talk. So Garroway pulled him off the elevator and sat him down, and his story was so fascinating that 3 days later he was on the Today Show and talking about his exploits in France and in 2 world wars and displaying his many medals and decorations that he had won. And that was actually the first time he had received any kind of significant recognition for his life in his native country, which was certainly belated, but a little bit of sweet success for Gene.
And it just took someone who was actually taking the time and interested in talking with him to figure out, hey, well, tell me about your life. Tell me, who you are.
Yep, exactly. He actually sat down, and unfortunately, at this point, he knew he was very ill. This is late 1960, and he was 65 years old. He sat down and started to write out his autobiography, which he did longhand on yellow legal pads and in French. And he entitled his autobiography, All Blood Runs Red, which to him meant, it was very significant. He had actually painted that slogan on the side of his airplane in World War I. Of course, meaning no matter what the color of your skin, if you fight for your country and you're injured or wounded, my blood is just as red as anybody else's. And so we took, Tom and I, that title in his honor and used that as the title of our book about Gene. He lived until 1961. He never got his autobiography published. Even though he was able to, through a friend, put it in front of several publishers in New York City. They all marveled at the story, but none of them believed that all of it was real, and therefore it never got published, which was sad for him at the time, but certainly very fortunate for Tom and I to pick up the story some 60 years later and run with it, which we hope we have done successfully.
Well, I think you've done a beautiful job with this story. And it has me kind of wondering, because it is a profound story. Are there any plans for a movie?
Well, I'm pleased to tell you that this is new news, but very welcome news. We have, the book has indeed been optioned for a full-length motion picture. It has been optioned by Lena Waithe, whom you might know. She's an Emmy Award-winning actor, producer, and she just released another movie, which is out right now, called Queen and Slim. And she has decided to take this on, and she's quite enthusiastic about it. Of course, you never know how long this sort of thing will take, but it's pretty timely and pretty topical, and we think that it's going to move right ahead. It's a great story, as you said, Marianne, and we're certainly very pleased and proud to have done it. But we also think that it's important for Black history, and as an example of a fellow who was powerful and determined, and it all worked out well for him.
Oh, and how important is that story? I mean, there's so much there, even when we look at different pieces of his life as, the pilot, the spy, the musician, all these different pieces. He is just an amazing individual. My goodness, Phil, where can our listeners connect with both you and Tom and be part of your community and learn more about this book?
Well, Tom and I both have Amazon pages, author pages on Amazon. We both have websites which are available on Amazon, and certainly can connect with anyone who wants to be in touch with us that way. And the book is available at just about every bookstore, the chain stores, as well as many of the independent bookstores around the country. It's everywhere, we're pleased to say. It's available in a large print version. It's available on audio, and it's also available in an electronic version for all the folks who have Kindles and Nooks or electronic readers of whatever type.
Well, it is making some huge waves. This book has gotten such great reviews. Phil, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, Marianne, it was my pleasure, and I thank you for the opportunity, and it's great to be here.
Well, thank you, Phil. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and, of course, to talk about your new book, All Blood Runs Red. Well, as we close out the old year and we've got the new year just starting, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and being such a part of the show. Thank you for all the letters and emails. I so appreciate hearing from you. And I wish you and your family a new year with all that your heart desires. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.